Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on biomedical instrumentation. In the previous set of videos, we looked at various types of flow meters. From this video, we will look at respiratory system and measurements of the respiratory system. So, in this video, we will give a brief introduction to the respiratory system and the mechanics of respiratory function. Very important to note that this is not a replacement for a physiology class. I request you to revise or refresh your understanding of the respiratory physiology. This is only a refresher class. So, I am going to quickly brush through these topics which I expect you to know already, because this is a course on biomedical instrumentation and it is not a course on physiology. However, I will refresh some basic physiology topics, but I request you to refresh or review in depth your understanding of the respiratory system, so you can understand these measurements better. So, what are the various capacities and volumes of interest? Recall this from your physiology class. By the way, there is a spelling mistake here. This is the maximum possible inspiration and this is the maximum possible expiration. I think so. I think the original picture that we got from some source is actually having this mistake. That is okay. We can correct that. We will keep coming back to this picture from time to time for every definition. So, there is this, we will start, for example, this tidal volume. What is this tidal volume? Tidal volume is the, before we go on, let us discuss some of these importance of this method. Example, essentially pulmonary physiology or respiratory physiology is the foundation for these measures of these parameters, and there is also an interest to understand the homeostasis of gas exchange that happens. There is a gas exchange that happens. O2 CO2 gas exchange happens, no? O2 and CO2 gas exchange happens at the alveoli of the lungs. So, these respiratory assessments essentially consist of assessing the performance of the lungs and the respiratory system, and these measurements are essential or critical. So, what is the performance of the lungs means? Pulmonary system. These parameters are absolutely critical for diagnosing or tracking the progress of pathology or tracking the progress of improvement in COPD. What is COPD? Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, pulmonary fibrosis, asthma, sinusitis, chronic bronchitis, and so on and so forth. So many diseases, chronic or allergic bronchitis, COPD, pulmonary fibrosis, and many other diseases. And it turns out that the amount of air that the lungs can accommodate depends on the type of breathing that you do. It is a huge field of interest. It is a huge field in which I think ancient Indians have excelled in a very big way. They have had an art of breathing. Is that such a big deal? Breathing. Breathing is the biggest deal, because if you do not breathe, you die. The critical nature of breathing and how critical it is for survival, we understood 5 years ago during the COVID time, when otherwise healthy people suddenly succumbed to an inability to breathe due to this deadly virus. No? We recall that. No? So, breathing, everything is dependent on breathing. If you do not breathe, you are essentially not alive. and our great grandfathers or our ancestors have essentially performed a grand research on this, this is not a course on yoga and pranayama, but those who are interested can definitely look at yogic breathing, yoga, pranayama and so on, which Indians have essentially mastered the art of breathing and ensured that through breathing they could get rid of many diseases. This is actually true. This is now known to be true. At least prevents several diseases from, for example, for sinusitis, pranayama is an excellent method to avoid getting allergic rhinitis. For example, it is known. How do you know? You are asking now. Because I have this problem, that is how I know. So, this beyond the scope of this course is these details of breathing and the types of breathing. But now let us come back to lung function. The lungs, the amount of volume that the lungs can accommodate essentially depends on the cycle of the breathing, that is a stage of the breathing cycle where you are in the breathing cycle, and these quantities are essentially classified into volumes and capacities. Volume is the actual volume, capacity is what you can do, capacity is your capacity, your ability to do, volume is what you are actually doing, there is a difference, volumes and capacities. So, these lung volumes, we start by describing lung volumes, we start by describing the tidal volume. So, tidal volume, this is the amount of air that is inhaled or exhaled during a normal quiet breathing. I am doing that one breath in or out, normal quiet breathing. How much does a human, adult, not a child, of course, not an infant or a baby or a child, neonate, an adult essentially breathes in or out about 500 ml of air, and that is a lot in one breath, in one cycle. So, that is this is TV, and that is about 500 ml. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that you can inhale after a normal inhalation. That is, I am normally breathing and then I am forcing myself to breathe in further. I am breathing forcefully inside. The amount of air that can be inhaled, but you are not actually normally doing it. That can be inhaled, that is a possibility, that can be inhaled forcefully after a typical inhalation, and that amount is actually 6 times the normal, that is about 3000 ml, and that is called as the inspiratory reserve volume. That is that value, that is inspiratory reserve volume, which is about 3000 ml. That is a lot, that much I could breathe in. Then after a normal exhalation, how much air can you exhale out? The extra air that can be forcefully exhaled after a normal exhalation is about 1200 ml. Note the difference. I can forcefully inhale about 3000 ml. I can forcefully exhale only about 1200 ml. Okay, that is called as the expiratory reserve volume. This is the expiratory reserve volume, and that is about 1200 ml. Okay, that is the expiratory reserve. Reserve means what I can do over and above the normal. Okay, then the residual volume. This is the amount of air left in the lungs after what is perceivably a maximum exhalation. You ask the person, completely exhale all the air you have, and the person says there is no more air left in the lungs. even then there will be some air. The person is not able to forcefully exhale till the last drop. When that happens, you die, because your lungs will collapse, right? Some residual volume of air continues to stay even after complete exhalation as perceived by the person. This residual volume is actually called as residual volume. It is called as residual volume. That is that value. That is residual volume. How much is that? About 1000 ml, I think. Is it not? About 1200 ml. Okay, I was wrong. About 1200 ml. So, your expiratory reserve volume and your residual volume are give or take equal. Capacities are essentially combinations of volumes that with which you can make some interesting observations or inferences. The maximum amount of air that you can inhale after a normal exhale. This is essentially the sum. After you have exhaled, I can essentially normally inhale one TV. What is a TV? Not the television. TV means in this case the tidal volume. One tidal volume plus I forcefully inhale. What is the forcefully inhaled volume? That is the inspiratory reserve volume. That is the inspiratory capacity. That is the sum of the tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. That is, these two put together is the inspiratory capacity. We looked at that. IC. This is IC. What is the value? What is the typical value? Approximately 3500 ml. Now, how do you know this? Because inspiratory reserve volume is 3000 ml, tidal volume is 500 ml. Then functional residual capacity. This is the volume of air that remains in the lungs after a normal exhalation. This is the residual capacity. This is after a normal exhalation, not a forceful exhalation. So, the amount of air that you can forcefully exhale is the expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. So, this is essentially ERV plus RV. That is this value. What is that value? This is the functional residual capacity. This is FRC. What is the value? That value is 1200 plus 1200, or rather 2400 ml approximately. This is the resting lung volume, during which when you are resting, this is the amount of air that continues to stay in the lungs. Vital capacity is the maximum amount of air you can exhale after a maximum inhale, the amount of air that you can exhale after a maximum inhale. Remember, you can do it. What is it that you can do? Residual volume is something that you cannot do. So, that is essentially the inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the ERV. Note that this will not include the RV, which is the residual volume. Okay. That is the vital capacity. That is the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume plus the expiratory reserve volume, but not including the residual volume. That is called as the vital capacity. This is a critical measure of all of these actually are critical measures of lung function health. This is quite frequently used in spirometry to assess the health of the lungs. And the total lung capacity is essentially the vital capacity plus the residual volume. Remember that the residual volume is a dead volume. This is the volume of air that is present always in the lungs. This is the volume of air that gives the lungs its shape. If this volume of air is also not there, or if there is no volume of air present, then because of the pressure deviations, pressure difference, pressure gradient that you observe, there will be a collapse of the lungs that will happen, which is what happens during dangerous situations. Then it's not a desirable situation. So, please, my request is review respiratory physiology. I have essentially summarized what needs to be taught over a period of several hours into a 10-minute video. Please, my request is review respiratory physiology and all these critical volumes and capacities. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at respiratory measurements, we looked at volumes, and capacities. What are the differences between the two? Please, and what is the critical nature of each of this? Take your time and completely review the respiratory physiology and what happens, how gas exchange, the process of gas exchange happens at multiple levels within the respiratory system. In particular, how gas exchange happens in the alveolus is of interest to you. Please review that. Okay. Thank you for your interest. With this, we end this video. Thank you very much for your attention.